I saw you
We
someplace.
come down in the winter.
Oh, so it's much, someplace
But you
much
thought
colder
she,
than I
you
thought.
thought she came all the way down
Yes.
just for this from Connecticut?
Ah, Connecticut's a lot colder than here
Yeah.
this time of year. Yeah, I can see why you come here. Well, maybe we should start with a little bit of, just like a little bit of meditation. Maybe we'll start with a little mindfulness and then some meditation on loving kindness. Can everybody hear okay? Is that working? All right, so get sit comfortably. Comfortable. And just first, just to settle our minds, let's do a little bit of mindfulness of breathing practice. So we can begin to gently bring our attention to the present moment sensations of the breath. So as you breathe in, be aware of the present moment sensations of breathing in. As you breathe out, aware of the present moment sensations of breathing out. Whenever thoughts arise, feelings, just notice them. Like the way you might notice a cloud passing by in the sky. So you don't fight against them, you don't judge them, you don't follow them. You just kind of let them go by and gently bring your attention back to the breath. And so still, right? Whatever thoughts or feelings arise, you notice them. Bring your awareness back to the breath. And just for a few minutes, we can be aware of our breath and any other present moment physical sensations. So when thoughts arise, we let them go. We're aware of the breath, of our body on the cushion. Feet on the floor. Your hands resting. do a little bit of loving kindness meditation. So we'll begin with ourselves. So you think thoughts like, may I be happy, may I be well, may I be safe, may I know peace, may I experience joy. As you're thinking those kind of thoughts, continue thinking them towards yourself, and you imagine a light in the nature of loving kindness, radiating from the very center of your heart and gradually filling up your whole body. First, it's like filling your torso, your arms and legs, your head. And that light is in the very nature of those kinds of loving thoughts. Loving first towards yourself. So that light has a nature of energy, of love, wishing, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I be peaceful, may I be joyful. You imagine that energy, like that light energy, completely filling up your body. You can imagine that same light, like radiating out, filling this whole room. So now we're still including yourself. You can also feel for everyone in this room. You have the thought, may we all be happy. May we be well. May we all be safe. May we all be peaceful. May we all be joyful. And you imagine that light radiating out from you, like touching and filling everyone in the room, so that they feel those wishes, and they feel loved and surrounded by love, embraced by that loving energy that wishes their highest well-being. You can imagine that energy gives them peace, well-being, happiness. You can imagine that energy going out like from this room, so it includes still you, everyone in this room. Imagine it like radiates out through all of Deerfield Beach. Reaching out to touch and to fill everyone in this area as we think, we have those thoughts. May all those beings be happy. May they all be well. May they all be safe. May they all have peace. May they all have joy. A few minutes, as you stay with that, you can just play with it. So you can keep it just with this room, you can spread it to the town, or you can, if you like, you can have that, like imagine that light energy filling all of Florida. May all the beings, all the people, all the sentient beings actually, in a state, like, be happy, be well, be safe. May they have peace, may they have joy. At whatever point that feels like enough for you, it's okay. If you feel like it, you can play with spreading it out to the whole nation, or hemisphere. Or planet. If you like, you can even imagine like infinite rays of love like radiating from you around the whole planet and filling the entire universe. So that the universe is like radiant with love. Love filling galaxies. And then the thought would be, may all beings have happiness. May all beings be well. May all beings be safe. May all beings have ultimate peace. May all beings have ultimate joy. And when you're ready, you can come back like to a more interactive mode. Actually, let's do that. Maybe I'll ask a question. Just that simple meditation on love. Like, I think nobody has to share, but does anyone? What was it like for you to meditate on love?
Love it.
What's that?
I love it.
You love meditating on love. That's a nice way to put it. That's a good way to say it. Any other experiences?
I had a bit of trouble with the type of love as a Buddhist, because I've been taught, and this was the first time actually, and I think it's good, that there was this feeling. Because many of the teachings from the Geshes or other, I never heard that really about love, meditating on, love. And it was a different, I was very confused, actually. I didn't know how to meditate on that, actually.
Well, then it's good. You're doing it. It's great. Yeah, any other comments before I go on? I'll say something.
Yeah, I was actually thinking on drive down, you know how I was going to ask you, like, how do I really, I want to achieve bodhicitta in this lifetime. And this is the practice, obviously. I said, oh, here is the answer. So it's like practicing, it's really like practicing.
It is, isn't it?
It's good. I enjoyed it.
Well, we'll say more about bodhicitta. But actually, so maybe I'll say, so like, I was thinking this afternoon, I thought I wanted to start talking about love, like focus on love a little bit. And I think it's interesting, like if you look in the Lamrim, right, the stages of the path to enlightenment, it's interesting, love, right, love, if you think about the process of developing bodhicitta, I mean, there are two methods for generating bodhicitta and so on, but, right, the process really is, it's quite interesting. Maybe I'll make a comment about bodhicitta first, because if you think about it, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like, you were saying to realize bodhicitta, right? So I often think, like, what is bodhicitta? Maybe some people don't know, right? But if you think about it, so bodhicitta, right, would be this, it's really interesting. Like, so first you would have to develop imagine this, so first you'd have to develop a sense of love, right? You would meditate on love. Actually, that makes me think of Rinpoche Rinpoche, like, who was one of my close teachers. He did like retreat on bodhicitta under the direction of Pabonka Rinpoche, where Pabonka Rinpoche would say, okay, meditate on this. They would go off to like a hut or a cave or something and meditate for months on just like one little, he was already a geshe, like a high geshe and a great reincarnate lama, but he would go and just sit and meditate on love, like for months. And they would come back and talk to Pabonka Rinpoche, and Pabonka Rinpoche would say, what was your experience? And then he would give him like one little more instruction. He had done that for all the stages. And then he actually, once he told a friend of mine, he said it was easy to realize everything up to bodhicitta, and then bodhicitta was harder. But implying he had realized bodhicitta, of course. And he did it in that way, just like, and he was saying, like, because you have to stay with one topic. And the point being this is like so if you're meditating on bodhicitta, actually, right, so you might spend months on just love, right? And what you would eventually do, what Rinpoche Rinpoche did, for example, there, and what one does, is one meditates on love over and over. Until, first of all, one develops a sense of love, they say, like, first of all, that embraces all beings equally, right? And that's overwhelmingly powerful, right? Like they say, like the love that a mother has for her only child. But if you think about it, I want to that's good we're talking about this. So the idea would be this, though, and this is just love, then you have to, that's not bodhicitta yet, right? But so if you imagine the person is doing their retreat, meditating on love, to realize that stage towards getting bodhicitta. And I wanted to sort of talk about that anyway, so I'll say something about it, which is, like, I think sometimes we think of it as, like, very abstract. Like, if we think of, somebody who meditated on love and they've realized love, it somehow seems, like, foreign or abstract. It does to me oftentimes, like, especially if I haven't thought about it. But actually, what we're talking about really is this, is we know, actually the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, right? And the Buddha's first noble truth was the truth of suffering, because that's what we're familiar with. So that's why the Buddha taught it first, was like, if he started with the truth of cessation of suffering, liberation, nobody would know what he was talking about. Because nobody, in other words, by definition, his audience didn't, actually, it would be useless to talk about the truth of cessation to an audience that had already realized cessation. So he had to start with what people were familiar with, the truth of suffering. And so actually we know about this because the truth of suffering is our ordinary experience. And I want to talk a little, so we're familiar with this thing. What love is working with emotions, isn't it? And what I always think is, like, we actually know about this, right? Because actually some of us are examples, have had periods of our lives where we're examples of this, and certainly we know people, right? Like, so if you think about that, like, there are people you know, right, who are let's say, great yogis of anger. Being ironic, right? It's not really yoga. Right? But in other words, like, somebody who's had gained a high realization of anger, being sarcastic in a sense, not sarcastic, ironic, right? Like, it means that they can feel anger that fills the entire universe, right? From their subjective experience. And what is rage? That's that, isn't it? Whereas when somebody's experiencing, like, overwhelming rage, and their experience is like, it's, what do you say? Like, I saw red, like the whole universe looked red, right? That's their experience, right? And then anybody they see, like if you're in a state of rage, whoever you see, you can't stand them. Like, you wish you could just punch them in the face or something, right? Like, destroy them or something, right? If you're really enraged. And then like also with rage, like a person who really is habituated to that, the slightest trigger can give rise to it, right? Like just anything, you know, somebody just like, if somebody's smiling at them and they just go like that, like the other person's facial expression changes, you know, like, oh, you know, you can have that, right? And then also so that person became habituated to anger, right? Because they thought certain thoughts, they habituated their physiology to it, they habituated their imagery, their mental imagery, their cognitions, and so on. Their whole brain actually got, you know, also habituated to it, their mind got habituated to it, their body got habituated to it. And then anything can trigger humongous rage, right? And then the same thing with anxiety. I often think of these two examples, because every week I see people, I'm a psychologist, so every week I see people have those two, for example, right? But anxiety is the same thing, right? Like, we all worry sometimes. But if you were to if you wanted to become like an expert at anxiety, it'd actually be quite easy, right? Like, all you have to do is, like, if you started thinking, actually people do this, right? If you started spending 7 or 8 hours a day thinking about what could go wrong, which is what people do unintentionally, not on purpose, and then actually drink a lot of coffee while you think about everything that could go wrong. If you were like to think of everything that could go wrong, and that'll start your physiology, right? It'll speed up your physiology. Like, so drink a lot of caffeine and think about everything that go wrong, right? And you'll start feeling like you're gonna have a heart attack. You know, and then if you start imagining, visualize all the things that go wrong, right? Start visualizing them all. Like, and then think about everything terrible that could happen to you, and everything terrible that could happen to everybody else, and eventually you'll feel like the entire universe is crushing you, right? And then the tiniest trigger, actually there are people like that, right? Where the tiny, you know, like, so somebody, you know, they hear somebody 3 aisles away, whatever, sneeze, and they think, I'm gonna die, you know, like, right? It's like the tiniest trigger, right? So we know about emotions like this. And my point is, we understand how emotions work if you just think of your own experience, right? And the same thing with, like, you know, I mean, any emotion can be cultivated. The Dalai Lama often points this out. It's the Dalai Lama says, you know, our body, if we train our body, you can become stronger or something, right? But there's a limit, right? Like, a person can train so much, but there comes a point where you can't lift what a crane can lift, right? You'll train your body a certain amount, and your body will reach a limit. The Dalai Lama says the mind has no limit. Whereas if you train your mind, there's no limit to what it can do, because the mind is not physical. And so the mind can become limitless, right? So you can have, your subjective experience can be like the whole universe, right? Infinite. And so we understand that about panic attack, right? Or a rage attack or something like that. So this person who's trying to train in bodhicitta, they would do that for love, right? So they would go around, and the tiniest trigger, and actually I always think this, like, we don't have words for that, right? Like a rage of love. I often think of that, right? I always do it that. A rage of love and a panic attack. Rather a compassion attack. You know? So if you imagine, instead of a panic attack, you have a compassion attack. Like, you know, so you just see somebody suffering and you're overwhelmed, right? Or you see and that's what this person who's training in bodhicitta is doing. They would just go meditate on love so much, right? That then, like, that person, you know, they're just like, they're on the bus, right? And they just see somebody, and it's like this overwhelming feeling in them of love. Then they look at this next person, overwhelming feeling of love. You know, they think of somebody and an overwhelming feeling of love. And it starts to be where it's, and you know, sometimes again, I think the problem for us sometimes is that we think of it like, oh, that's what saints do, as if that's somebody else. And that's what Rinpoche used to say, actually. He used to say, you know, the Lama I was talking about, say, like, anybody can do that. Like, it's what you're supposed to do. You have the potential. That's you know, that's who you are. You're a human being. And you've met these teachings. Anybody who's a human being and has met these can do that. So you can do it. That was his point, right? But so it's just habituation, right? So this person would meditate on love like that, right? Over and over and over. And one thing that Lama Tsongkhapa points out, which I think is quite beautiful in his Lam Rim text, Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point. He says, if you're really going to go deeply into meditating on love, he uses that example. I think it's a good example. He says, you know, what we just did is a beginning point, right? So you imagine spreading it and spreading it and spreading it out. But then he says, if you really want to make progress, then you have to start using specific people in your life. He says, because if you just meditate in a generic way on love, your love will stay generic and you won't make much progress, actually. He says you can spend a long time and it'll be similar. You'll only progress a little, even if you put a lot of time in. But he says, if you actually think of people, like he says, start with people you already love a little bit and just meditate again and again on love for them until it becomes overwhelming. Right? And then he says, then start thinking, and this is interesting, he says, like, if you think about it this way, every day, you actually just think of it for yourself. Every day, you know, in our lifestyle, we come across or pass by people and we don't even notice their humanity. You know, like the same way you might notice a tree or a car or a chair. You know, like the chairs are in the room. You know, like later, if you were to say, like later, if you were to think back, you remember, oh yeah, the chairs looked like this, and there was this person over there, and you didn't really even register them, right? And if you're going to train in love, what Lama Tsongkhapa says is, you have to then, every day, think of those people you ignored, and meditate on love for them.
Just so quick, are you using the word love as a synonym for compassion?
No.
Okay, this is what I was looking for.
Because, and sometimes, actually, I'll say something about that.
Okay.
So actually, and actually, in the Buddhist teachings, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, we actually, I always sometimes joke about it. It's like the word love in English is it's like one word.
Exactly.
And I think sometimes we overburden that poor word. You know, because like, I love ice cream, I got a love score in tennis, you know, I love, like, it's like, that word has to do everything, you know, I love my children, whatever, like, you know, whatever, I love my, you know, family, I love my friends, you know, whatever, like, it's this generic word. Buddhism actually, the Buddhist teachings, Buddhist psychology has a humongous, like, what's the word for this? You know, like, I sometimes think it's like Eskimos talking about, you know, this famous thing, right? Eskimos have how many words for snow? Forget it now. This is a number of it. Well,
A lot.
a lot, yeah, I can't remember the exact number now. But actually, I wrote this down because I was thinking about it the other day. So if you think about love in the Buddhist context, right, there's a love that's like, first of all, there's the idea of cherishing others, right? So cherishing others is love. I once asked Yume Kensho, I asked that question. I said, so we have this phrase cherishing others, and then we have this phrase love. Are they the same or are they different? He said, they're the same, you know. But that's a particular kind of love. That was what you get into. That's like love that sees the other as precious and close and has a warm feeling towards them. That's one kind of love, right? So there's one kind of love where you feel close to somebody, right? You have this warm feeling towards them. You feel like they're not distant but close to you, and you have a kind of affection. That's the word. Love that's a kind of an affection. That's one kind of love. Then there's another kind of love that's actually more powerful than that. And that's the love that wants the other to be happy. And there actually, even without that one, then there's a love that just wants the other to be happy in a kind of temporary way, right? And then there's a love that wants the other to be ultimately happy, like achieve their highest welfare. Those are all different versions of love. They're different, actually, right? Like you could feel affectionate to somebody, but not have that deep feeling of wanting them to be happy. You know, and then you can want somebody to be happy a little bit, but not really have this like aspiration for them to achieve their ultimate happiness. Then all of those can still be biased, though, right? Like I could have that. Actually, I sometimes think that. Actually, I think even if you have the one that wants them to be happy, like I sometimes think, well, even mobsters have that, right? Like, you know, like gangsters have that towards their kid or something, right? Like, even the worst people, like, you know, even people who aren't really even good people have that towards somebody usually. Not all. Some people have it just nobody, but many people. I mean, that's not hard to achieve, right? Most people have some version of that for somebody or other. Not everybody, but most people have it. But then, so those, you know, then there's a love, right? That's like those other ones, but that so you could take those other kinds of love, and then when you apply them to all beings equally, right? So then you call it, what do you call it? Universal love, maybe, or what's another word for it? What is it? Immeasurable love. That's immeasurable or universal. I think immeasurable is usually how it's talked about it, right? So then even within immeasurable love, right? There could be an immeasurable love that feels affection for all beings, or there could be an immeasurable love that wishes the highest welfare for all beings, that wishes them to be happy and achieve every kind of happiness. But if you're meditating on bodhicitta, so now we'll get to compassion in a sec. So like the person who's meditating on bodhicitta would first create a very stable experience of that, where they would check, right? Like, so if you could imagine, like, you would just keep meditating on that, meditating on it. And, you know, again, as I'm talking about it, I'm just curious, like, in one way, if you don't think about it deeply in terms of your own experience, you could think that seems far-fetched. Like, oh, to feel love for everybody. But just like ordinary people have that, their anger for everybody. Like, if like anybody can go around, if you just, like, anybody can go around and just like create anger like that, and then they have anger for everybody. they get angry so easy, and even the people close to them they get angry at, strangers they get angry at. You could drive on the road and they want to like kill everybody on the road. Like, so if somebody can do that with anger, of course you can do that with love. Love is more fun, for one thing. Love feels better. Love's more realistic, right? Anger that wants to kill everybody, it's like you'll end up in jail in a second. Like love that wants others to be happy, you actually get positive feedback from, like you're going to get a lot more positive feedback from others if you cultivate love. You'll feel more happy. You'll feel more peaceful. Like, so actually love is easier to do that with than anger, right? Because it's more, in one sense it's easier, because it's more realistic. You get more positive feedback. It's more self-reinforcing. Anger is miserable, or isn't it? I mean, it's a miserable feeling. Anxiety is a miserable feeling, and people can do it with anxiety. Of course you can do it with, like, because if you can actually think that, if somebody else could develop panic attacks, I can develop love attacks. It's got to be possible. Like, you just have to think. But the problem is that somebody who's developing severe, any of those negative emotions, check, right? Whereas you check with yourself. When you're really angry, right, you're up all night thinking. Like, you can't even fall asleep because you're so angry. You're thinking what you're angry about, right? Or if you're really terrified, right, like anxious, really, really terrified, then you're up, you can't even sleep at night. You're so, right, you fall asleep and you're anxious, you wake up and your first thought is anxiety, or whatever the negative emotion is, right? So you're putting all that time in. So of course you become really good at it. I mean, good at it in a negative sense. But, so you just have to do the same thing with love, right? And Yimei Kensurovic also said this to me one day. He was saying, like, he was pointing out, like, so sometimes people say, but it feels phony at the beginning. Like, if I try to do that, it feels like, anger feels normal to me, but, natural, but the love feels phony. And he said, well, of course it feels phony. You don't have much love. You've never done it. You don't have any practice. So, like, anything, when you start it, it feels, like, if you learn to dance, it feels weird. If you try a new musical instrument, it feels weird. Anything you're doing that's new feels weird. So he's saying, if it feels, so people say, oh, it feels weird, I'm going to stop. Well, that's silly. Like, anything you want to get good at, you just do it. And then you keep doing it, and it gets, and that's what Shanti Deva says. He says that. He says, everything becomes easy if you do it enough. Anything becomes easy through familiarity, is how he says it. So then eventually the person would just, you could see how that could happen. Actually, it wouldn't take that long until the person would go around and they would just feel this love for everybody. And then compassion is different. And I'll say the difference between love and compassion because you asked about it.
Yeah.
So the difference is this, actually. Like, love, right, includes, if you've cultivated to this, what we're describing, so you feel this close, warm feeling and you want others to be happy. But compassion in Buddhism is often defined as the wish to free someone from suffering. And I just want to say a little about the difference. Because in a way, I mean, love is, I'm going to go back in a minute and say more about love, because I want to share a little teaching about the benefits of love. But I'll just say a brief thing about compassion first. So, in one way, actually, so the Tibetan word for compassion is Ning Je. So Ning means heart, and Je means exalted, right? So or the sublime. So compassion is the most exalted. The Tibetan word for it, actually, I think it's beautiful. It means the most exalted state of a heart, of a person's heart, right? And what compassion, the difference between compassion and love, is that compassion is willing to embrace the darkest part of the other. Compassion is willing to embrace their deepest suffering, the parts that people are horrified about in themselves, and people's terror, and people's misery, right? Because love, you can imagine that, right? Oh, I want you to be happy, but I don't really want to, you can imagine that state, right? I do want you to be happy, but I don't really want to know about that. And compassion is the mind, so it's like, compassion is like love with a kind of element of courage and of willingness to embrace the suffering of others. So it actually comes after, if you look in the sequence of generating bodhicitta, that's why compassion comes after love, right? Is that it's harder. There is compassion includes the elements of love, but has a courageous aspect that's willing, that not just is willing, but that wants to face the suffering and the darkness and the pain of the other in order to help liberate them from that. So that's the difference between those two mental states.
Thank you.
And then I'll say more about compassion in a minute, but I want to actually read this because we were talking about love, right? And I went to this conversation. So there are various teachings that say that some sutras teach this, and then Nagarjuna taught it in this precious garland, and it's in the Lam room. But I kind of wanted to say something. So we just meditated on love, right? A few minutes ago, and I'll read from two different sources actually, because I also quoted something here that's not exactly here. So first I'll read this quote actually. This is from the Buddha actually. The Buddha himself said this in the King of State Meditative, in the Samadhi Raja, the King of Meditation Sutra. He said, many kinds of offerings without measure in myriads of neighboring pure lands. So he's talking about whole planets, right? So he's saying, if you were to fill entire planets, pure land planets, like heavenly planets, with the most remarkable offerings, and offer them to the most excellent beings in the universe, the benefits fall short of a fraction of the mind of love. And here Nagarjuna says, the merit of giving 300 types of food every day and 3 times cannot compare to the merits gained for meditating once for a short while on love. So actually, I just want to pause there. Like, you know, Buddhist, and I was thinking about this, Buddhist sutras and Buddhist teachings are filled with things like that. If you read the Mahayana sutras, they're filled with these like beautiful, expansive images. And I actually think, like, people rarely pause to think about that. Like, because there's actually, I've thought about it, I've actually done some searching. Like, I think it's a unique form of literature because it's a literature of love and compassion. Like, actually, our literature, like, if you think of Western literature, right, like Aristotle said, like, it should have conflict. He said, like, it's not even a meaningful story if there's not conflict. If you read the Buddhist, I remember the first time I read, like, the flower ornament scripture, I started reading it. And I was actually like, I couldn't read it at first. It was like, it was describing like bodhisattvas going from universe to universe, benefiting beings and giving away everything. And it was like this expansive vision that all the Mahayana sutras have. And part of that is like, again, it's like because we're not, I was like, it's just what I was saying earlier about what Kensur Jade said, right? If you're not familiar, then it feels unfamiliar, right? We're familiar, like actually it's sad. Like if you think of our stories, like if you, any movie you see, right? Like usually it's like, if you see a movie, it's what? An hour and 45 minutes of problem, and then if it's a happy movie, the last 10 minutes there's love. Like somebody falls in love and they maybe get married. That's if it's a comedy, right? If it's a tragedy, they all die. I guess, or a lot of people die. But if usually if there's like actually in the most uplifting movies, usually they have like 5 or 10 minutes where somebody's loving, you know, in them. And that's okay. I mean, it's better than not. But what he's saying here though is this vision of love, right? Like that love is more valuable than a whole planet of offerings, like planets and planets of offerings. He says, and Lama Tsongkhapa says this, for as little as the duration of a finger, to meditate on love, for as short as a finger snap, produces more merit than someone practicing celibacy and other kinds of pure conduct for 100,000 million years. So I want to say, like, you just did that, right? You just meditated on love. Like, do you believe Lama Tsongkhapa? Actually, like,
Yeah.
it's like that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying about you. Like, so, and my point is like he's challenging, I think, your sense of identity, isn't he? Like, he's saying like. He's saying here, you're an infinite, actually, the only way to make sense of what he's saying is if you're a being with infinite potential. Right? That's his view, that's the Buddhist view of you, actually, that you're a being with infinite potential. And that you meditating on universal love for that short, because it's universal, because it's immeasurable, has immeasurable benefits. Because that's the nature of mind, right? The mind can become infinitely something. In this case, infinitely love. Anyway, he goes on, the Nagarjuna goes on to say, there are 8 benefits of love, he describes. And he says, actually, I'll just read them. Nagarjuna says, if you meditate on universal love, or immeasurable love, the gods and humans will come to love you. They will protect you. You will have mental ease and much happiness. Poisons and weapons won't harm you. Mostly because nobody's going to want to kill you if you're meditating on love. You will achieve your aims effortlessly, and ultimately you will become Brahma. You'll be reborn as Brahma. Actually, and there's a word, like sometimes the meditation on on immeasurable love. Sometimes in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's sometimes called a Brahma Vihara. You may have heard that term. But what that means is that beings who meditate on infinite love, that's the cause of a kind of, actually we'll get into this, because what they're really saying there is this, actually the Buddhist view, well, I was going to stay on love, I'm not going to go to compassion for a while. Yeah. Actually, so another point, actually it's from Ken Rinpoche also, I love this point. He said, one day he was talking about, he was saying, the best way to conquer or control others is love. I thought, well, that's a funny way to put it at first, But I guess the point is like, actually it's really this. Shantideva says the same thing if you study it, right? What Shantideva says is, because if you conquer somebody through anger or aggression, you may succeed, right? This could be whether it's you personally, like with somebody, like let's say your spouse, right, or your friend. Or you get angry at them and you say, no, you have to do this and that. They may eventually do it because they're afraid of you, right? Or they just want you to shut up, so they may do what you want. But of course, then how do they feel towards you, right? They resent you, and they find you annoying, right? And they find you unpleasant, and they wish they could sort of, at the moment they kind of think, well, I'll do this, but I wish I didn't have to see this person anymore, right? That's how they feel, right? And then of course, what happens later? Well, later, the resentment comes back, at some point. Or anger comes back at you, or some, either resentment or anger or some kind of undermining comes back, right? So that's not successful. And Shantideva says the same thing with nations, right? Like a nation conquers another nation, right? And they think, oh, now we've conquered them. And he said, and Shantideva wrote this, over a millennium ago, right? But he was same thing was then, right? He was saying, so if a nation conquers another nation, what happens? Well, the nation waits until they don't have a gun at their thing, and then they undermine them, right? They kick them out. They cause problems for them, and so on, because of course they do, right? And that's like human history, isn't it? That's like the story of human history. And so the point is if you love, right? Actually, if you love somebody, they become your friend. And there's another point, actually, right? Usually, actually, it's funny, isn't it? When we're angry at somebody, it's actually because they're not doing what we think they should do because it would make us happy, right? We think it would make us happy if they would do this, and they don't want to do this, right? Whatever this might be. And, let's say it the right way, like, as long as you're in that mindset, right, actually you'll never win, right? Like if you're the person who's angry, right, I'm angry at you for not being, like, I'm angry at you for not being what I want you to be. Like, right, if I stay in that mindset, if I can somehow succeed in imposing my will on the person, they're going to resent me and not like me. If I fail to, then I'll just feel angry at them and stay angry, right? And so the only way to win is love. That's what it's saying. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because with love, what do you want? You want the other person to be happy and well and have the best that they can have, right? And actually, if you help that other person become that, well, then there's no problem, is there? I mean, then they're, you're supporting them being the best they can be. Well, that's the best they can be, right? So you're not going to get any better than that. So that's they say that's victory. There's that famous, beautiful story of the Buddha, right? This is the archetypal story of this, right? That when the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? That gesture he has of touching the earth, right? That was that, right? So it was actually, right, he sat down under the Bodhi tree and he said, that one night, right, he knew he was about to become enlightened, and he said, I'm not going to stand up from this seat until I become enlightened. Which is quite moving, even that, right? Imagine somebody knowing that. Saying, I will not stand up again. Right? And he sits under a tree, which is also beautiful. I think there's meaning to that. Right, but then there's this part, right, where Mara, who's like the king of all demons, right, comes with the hordes of demons, the army. And the demons attack the Buddha, and they're sending arrows, I guess, and spears or something. And what they say actually is the Buddha entered the samadhi, the concentration of love. Right? And there's this archetypal image, right, that as the arrows came, they turned to flowers and fell at the Buddha's feet. And the point is, I think part of the point of that story is you have to start doing that now. Does that make sense? Like, that's not a story just about the Buddha. That's saying that's what love is, the practice. That's our practice, right? And then that gesture of touching the earth, I think that's quite beautiful. After, so all the Maras, all the other demons, like, were attacking, and the Buddha meditated on love, and it all became flowers, and they're surrounded by flowers, right? And then they all left, and all that was left was Mara, the king of the demons, right? And he said, "You don't deserve to be alive." And that's when the Buddha touched the earth. And I think that's quite beautiful, right? Because actually, it's the Buddha. They say he called on Mother Earth as a witness, right? And that Mother Earth herself said, "I've watched, and he's practiced love, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. He's given to others. He's helped others. He's sacrificed for others." And to think of that, Mother Earth said, "I bear witness, he deserves to be enlightened." And then Mara thought, he gave up. And then the Buddha, then the sun rose, and the Buddha became the Buddha. That's quite beautiful, isn't it? Mother Earth bore witness. But, and part of that is like, that was the Buddha's practice, right? Was love. And it was through love that he conquered his own mental afflictions, and then benefited others, conquered more. So that's the practice in a way of love. Does that make sense? So go back. So then the bodhisattva, the person who wants to achieve bodhicitta, would eventually reach this point, right, where they were sort of like, what's the word? Like, you know, like that. Like, so wherever they went, they were having these like love attacks, rages of love. They were having this experience where, because part of that is it has to feel like it's for all beings, but also it's for each being. That's really important, isn't it? Because it can't just be vaguely for all beings. It has to be for all beings, but also for each being, right? And then that same person would then go meditate on compassion, right, which has that more brave, courageous attitude towards each being. And they would meditate on that. And there are various ways to meditate. We can get into that if you want, but they would meditate on compassion for all beings and for each being, until the same experience started happening with compassion. Now you can see how it would be much easier to have compassion once you have love for each being. It's much easier to develop compassion, but there's an additional element, right? You have to learn to kind of, to have that courage. You know, there's that practice of tonglen, right? Taking and giving, where you imagine taking on. And I always think of this. I always loved it. My best friend, my closest friend, we often have these conversations about Dharma. And when he first started to do tonglen, he called me up and he said, "All right, I can do 2 breaths. Like I could breathe in once, twice, and then I'm done." He said, like, "I can't do it." And I was like, "Oh, I love that. You're so honest." Like, you know, it's like, that's it. He's like, "That's all." He's like, "That was all the courage I got. I don't want," he's like, I don't want any more than that. That's all for today. Maybe tomorrow I could do 2 breaths again, worth of taking on the suffering of others. You know, because, of course, you're not really taking it on, but the idea is that you're trying to cultivate the bravery that's willing to embrace that, right? He's like, "That's as much bravery as I've got." Now he can do much more of that practice. But I love that, like, he didn't just do it intellectually. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just some intellectual exercise. Like, it was like, no, I'm going to really be honest with myself. You know, and he's so like, and then he would think of some particular stuff, and he would say, you know, like, "Oh, I don't want that." Like, and it was like, but that's the practice, right? That's the practice of that, of training in compassion, is you have to face that feeling, right? And I want to say something else about that too, like, because part of the training in compassion is courage, you know, the courage to face suffering. But part of that courage has to come from actually an understanding. And I wanted to say something about that today. Because the understanding that underlies compassion is the understanding of our interdependence. Like, and I was thinking of that. I actually thought of that quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Right? That was a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. But that's similar to this recognition of compassion. In other words, the recognition in compassion is, it's what? It's like, it's this recognition that we're all one family. Or that we're all, right, like in Buddhism we say all mother sentient beings, right? That's the part of the training, right? it's viewing each being as intimate with oneself as one's mother or child. Like that we're that intimate with all others. You know, I was actually thinking about that a little bit, so I'll just say, like, you know, the ultimate teaching of Buddhism is dependent origination, right? Which is the idea that everything that arises is dependent on other factors, right? The Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama often said, sometimes I heard him say, if there were going to be a slogan for Buddhism, it would be dependent interdependence or dependent arising. You know, the things are which is actually, you know, true, isn't it? Whereas everything, and part of the problem, you know, like that, you know, that we all have, that my friend was embodying in that moment, that we all have, is this feeling like I'm separate. Like, oh, I don't, as if we're somehow not connected, and as if the suffering of others somehow is separate from us, and which is this sort of egocentric illusion, I guess. I think egocentric illusion. And actually, I was thinking about that recently. I was like, every aspect of Buddhism, especially these teachings on compassion, and then also the teachings on emptiness, and that's why they sometimes say, if you meditate, they actually say that if you meditate on love and compassion enough, then the realization of emptiness will be very easy. There's that famous story of Atisha's teacher, Dharmarakshita, who wrote the Wheel of Sharp Weapons Mind Training. And they say, right, that Atisha had a much more high view of emptiness, of a philosophical view of emptiness than his teacher. But his teacher had realized universal love and meditated on love. His main meditation was love. They say he naturally then just realized the ultimate nature of things because of the power of his love. So anyway, the idea here is like that we're interdependent with others, right? And that others' suffering is connected with us, right? And I mean that idea, right? That we're, His Holiness Dalai Lama always says that, right? When he goes places. I was actually struck by that recently. I was thinking, like, you know, His Holiness Dalai Lama, when he goes any place, says, "My brothers, my sisters." Right? But that's the same thing that anybody who's meditated a lot on love says, isn't it? Like, it doesn't matter, you don't have to be Buddhist to say that. Like, I mean, I was like thinking that, like, some Hindu teachers, I would say, oh, they say the same, like, that's their experience. When they see people, and then Christian mystics, that's their experience. You know, so that's love, right? Is this recognition that we're all one family, or we're all, I was thinking that word kin, right? Kin and kindness have the same root. It's a recognition of this. And maybe I'll just keep going, actually. Okay, so I'll finish about bodhicitta now. Right, so the person would meditate on love till they had that experience. Then they would meditate on compassion till they had this experience, like the same thing, right? Where they would be having this overwhelming inner experience of compassion with whoever they met. That's still not a bodhisattva. Actually, that person would still not be a bodhisattva. And actually, they say that people who are practicing the individual vehicle of individual liberation also can have that experience, do have that experience. Because then there comes a unique, and they actually call it the unusual or unique attitude. So the person who's been meditating then develops this this is actually where we talk, like the center is connected, foundation for is connected to the foundation for the preservation of the Mahayana tradition, right? So the Mahayana tradition actually begins at this unusual attitude. So it's the person who has that kind of compassion then says, I take responsibility for the welfare of others. Not only do I wish it, but I'm willing to take action. I'm willing to take responsibility. That everybody's well-being is the purpose of my existence. Right? And at that point, like that person who's been meditating on compassion, it's like one step beyond. And again, like we don't even have words for this, do we? Like that's a different kind of compassion. Does that make sense? It's this very specific kind of compassion that takes responsibility. I noticed that with I can see the difference very easily when I saw my sister. Like I would see, like when her kids are like one of her children is upset, I have compassion for them, but she's the one who runs over and does something. You know, like I'm like, oh, I wish they weren't upset. And I'm still sitting there, and she's like helping me. You know, like I haven't even gotten off the couch, and she's already helping me. You know, she has that towards her children, right? Like that feeling of responsibility, that feeling of absolute commitment of responsibility. You know, like and before anybody else would, do something, she would do it, right? But the bodhisattva has that feeling. The person who's training in the bodhicitta has that feeling for everybody, for all beings. And then once the person has that, then they develop the wish to become enlightened, right? To fulfill that aspiration, they realize they have to become enlightened, and then they develop that wish. It's actually interesting, right, to think that's possible. It's possible to achieve your goal that you asked, that you mentioned about, right? Like, because, and actually it's interesting because each next step is easier because of the previous. Actually, because it's interesting, isn't it? I just said the Buddhist slogan would be everything is dependently arisen. So bodhicitta is dependently arisen. And I'll share one more point about that. And then, one of the things I really liked was another point. It was like it was again Yume Kensuru. She said, so you generate a kind of artificial bodhicitta at first, right? And then he said, and actually, where it's like you don't really have that overwhelming love and compassion yet, but you're kind of giving rise to it through effort. Like you're sort of approximating. That's a good way. You're approximating. And then he said, I like this. He said, and that's how all the bodhisattvas started. How else would they have realized bodhicitta? They all approximated, and they kept approximating it, and they kept, sort of thinking about it, and they kept imagining it, and they kept trying, and then eventually, it became their way of being in the world, right? And there's no other way anybody ever realizes bodhicitta except for that. And I was like, oh, that's really beautiful, because again, everything becomes easy through habituation, and whatever you're habituating yourself to. And so I guess I'll ask this question, like related to that. So think about yourself first thing in the morning. That's funny. Like, what's the first thing? Actually, we all have certain like 1 or 2, 3. It's not always exactly the same, but most people have a certain like set of things that are usually what their mind is like when they first wake up in the morning. Mm-hmm. Some people it's like, I want my coffee. I can't drink coffee, so that's not on mine because it makes me sick. But oh no, I have all this to do today, or whatever it would be for you. Like everybody has some, right? And that's like, it's interesting. That's like whatever you are. Like if you think about it this way, whatever your first thoughts are when you first wake up in the morning, what's your like mind like? It's like in some way that's your baseline. That's what you're habituated to, right? That's your normal habit of mind, like your normal level of. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Like to think, okay, well that's where I'm at now, and it's good to face the truth. Like, okay, that's where I'm at now, and then you can say like, well, then who would I like to be first thing in the morning? What would I like? When I said that, it popped in my head. I often have this image of, it's actually the old version. So I think his name's Aleister Crowley when he played Scrooge in the old version of A Christmas Carol. After he thought he had gone to hell, right? He had the vision of Christmas, Ghost of Christmas. Was it past, and then present, and then future? Yeah. And after the future, right, he wakes up, and I like that actor because he like looks around, he goes, I'm alive! I'm alive! And he leaps up out of bed, he runs to the window, and he says, boy, what day is it? What day is it? And he says, it's Christmas Day, what? And then he says, call the grocer, call the, whatever, I want to buy things for everybody. And like, wow, like that's it. That had not been his way of waking up to that point, of course. Right. But it's embodying a way of like, wow. Imagine that if that was like, I sometimes think like, I mean, not quite, but sort of like that's an approximation of how a bodhisattva wakes up every morning. Right? It's like if you were going to do an approximation of it in a story or something, that would be a reasonable approximation. They may not do this and shout, but it's kind of like that, right? Like, wow, I'm alive. I get to, and then what? Actually, what would be your answer? Like, if you were really thinking that way, right? Like, and pause for yourself. Like, what would it be? Like, if you actually recognized, wow, I could, like that, right? Like him, right? Because he had this recognition. I could have died. I could be dead. I could have lost this opportunity to, like, I could have, because what his recognition was what? I could have lived a life of zero meaning, absolutely no meaning at all, right? And I have a chance before I die to live a life that has some meaning. That was his recognition, right? But we all have that. That's our existential condition, actually, isn't it? So if you ask yourself, what would I like what would you like it to be? Just pause and think about it. Like, Because it's possible. You can change it. That's something you can change. Nobody else, like nobody's imposing on you anything for first thing in the morning, right? So like, what would I like my heart to be like, and my mind to be like first thing in the morning, right? And I have like Lama Zoparnamshe often, right? He often gives that, right, where he says like that advice, like yeah, it's very similar actually to what to Scrooge, right? To Scrooge's insight, right? Where he says you think, wow, like I'm alive, and other people died while I was asleep, right? And I didn't. And then actually there's a point though, I don't know, right, I'm a bit meandering, but I think it's good actually, so I'll go with this one. Because there's also a pure point here in Buddhism that's related. One is that's true, actually we all know that, right? In other words, everybody knows people die, right? You know, and every day and so on. We all know that we can die any moment. That's just true. We don't think about it, but it's true. But then Buddhism has this point actually about you. It's like, I call it, in the Lam Rim teachings, they call it precious human rebirth. But I sometimes call it like the Buddhist perspective on your existential situation. Because what Buddhism says about you, personally, like each of you here, right? What Buddhism says is that in the universe, on this planet, this is somewhat true, and the universe is very true, that there are limitless different forms of life. Right? And on this planet there are, if you can't even count them, right? Like all the, like, if you ever watch like schools of minnows, right? Or if you watch ants, like, I actually I was thinking that just like, I live in a fairly small townhouse, and just the, it's not like big house, but just the yard there, I was like, wow, there are like infinite ants out in the grass. Like, I could never, they're not literally infinite, but I can't imagine how many little tiny ants. You know?
I just, every time I hear the stories about ants, I was doing a little retreat in that little house in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And I put saffron in the bowls. Well, ants love saffron. And they used to come in long lines.
Oh, to get your saffron.
Go up the bowl. And I was wondering what brought that. It took me a long time to realize it was the saffron.
Wow. You made them happy.
Well, yeah, but I wasn't too happy.
You weren't happy.
A lot of difficulty with it.
That's funny. That's interesting.
When I realized I took, I put clean water,
Yeah.
they went away. They didn't come back.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny.
Yeah, very funny.
That's interesting. So yeah, so there are limitless ants there too. Obviously. And the Buddhist perspective really is that it's almost unimaginable, really. Like, it's that your personal form, like your personal current life situation, is the best life situation in the entire universe for developing spiritual progress, for becoming a bodhisattva, or becoming enlightened. And particularly for becoming enlightened, actually. And I often think this, like, even, sometimes people who are Buddhist actually pray to be reborn in a Pure Land. Like, Buddhist people sometimes do that. But then the Panchen Lama, my favorite Buddhist figure, one of my 2 or 3 favorite Buddhist figures in history is the first Panchen Lama, Losing Chogi Gyaltsen. And he said, actually beings in Amitabha's Pure Land pray to be reborn here. Because you make faster progress to enlightenment. The really compassionate bodhisattvas pray to come here because this is the best place if you want to become enlightened quickly. And actually it's interesting why. Actually, there are a couple of reasons. One is we have just the right mix, apparently, of happiness and well-being, in other words, leisure, time to think, where you have enough peace of mind to think and contemplate and reflect on yourself, but then enough suffering, that you have to have suffering. Right? Because how else are you going to develop compassion? If you don't have suffering, then you can't empathize with the suffering of others. Right? And so we have this like marvelous mix of intelligence, and then we're mammals. Right? And so like a mammal, actually we're like our physiology is grounded in connection and compassion. Right? Whereas because of the way we're carried in the womb and born, and we have such a long period, right, of living with our parents compared to other animals, right, even other mammals. So like our whole physiology is designed so that it's conducive to compassion. You'd say that our brains are conducive to developing compassion. Then also part of the reason the Panchen Lama said that is unique to highest yoga tantra. That in this planet there's those teachings. And we have certain kind of physiology that can do that practice too, that don't exist in other places. So it's better than Amitabha's Pure Land that way, if you're interested in that topic. But Anyway, so part of this thing, first thing, all that's to say, first thing in the morning, right? So first thing in the morning, if you have that Buddhist perspective, this is the Buddhist perspective. You don't have that. Some of you may not have that, but that's the Buddhist perspective. Is that you right now have the most valuable, most precious, most wonderful condition and brain, and so you can do amazing things, right? So then Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, so I don't know how long I'll have this life, and so the purpose of my life should be love, compassion, and bodhicitta. And he said, so that's what that he said. That's a good way to wake up in the morning. That was his advice. He said that's a nice way to wake up in the morning. First, so like we can compare. Well, how do I do it then? You know, how's my morning routine compared to that? Maybe I'll pause there because I've just been kind of talking about this topic of love and compassion. You can call me to ask good questions, but are there other people with questions? I just want to get a chance. Yeah.
Okay, so first thing in the morning, we wake up to our true selves because we haven't put our mask on yet, right?
Yeah.
So that's who we really are. Later in the day, we've had our coffee and all our stimulants and put on our makeup and we're looking much better, right? But what I hear you saying is whatever we're feeling inside that may have a little dark element, depression, anger, has become habit.
Right.
But it wasn't habit when it started. We may have come out of an unloving family, an alcoholic situation, whatever, right? So there's all kinds of situations that started this before it became our habit in life. And is there something in Buddhism that allows us to look at that dark side rather than just, oh, okay, now I'm going to be happy. Now I'm going to be sharing all my love with everyone. And what worries me about that, remember when positive affirmations, everybody was doing them, you could hear the people walking in the streets, you know, I'm going to be wealthy now, and all that. And to me, it reminded me of a crumbling cake with this wonderful icing over it. And once, you know, if you go through the icing, the cake is still crumbling, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we deal with something that all of us have, you know, more or less, whatever? How do we deal with that rather than just saying, now I'm happy?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, first of all, there are many. Buddhism presents many options, but and some of that is actually our main topic for tomorrow too. So, but I'll say some now. And because I mean, there are many different ways one can relate to that. I'll say more about them, but I'm going to just give one today, and then we'll go into more tomorrow. That's what I'll say because I think it's a great question. Because I think you're right. Like, in other words, if there is you know, if one doesn't face and look at and deal with what actually is, you know, then say it right, it can become a kind of fake. I mean, and there's a kind of, I guess there's a difference between like what I was saying earlier about a bodhicitta that's still, what's the word, that's still constructed or still sort of effortful. That's different, but that's not to ignore the suffering we have, or and so again, there are many methods, but I'm going to give one now, because if in the context of compassion, that's what I'm going to focus on. I think I want to suggest two steps actually, or a few steps, and the first step that I want to suggest is a genuine self-compassion. You know, because if you don't have compassion for yourself, you're not going to have real compassion for others, or your compassion for others is going to be quite limited. But so self-compassion, though, I think it's very, and actually there's a lot of good, I mean, Buddhism talks about that, and also there's now some quite a good scientific research on the benefits of it and how to cultivate it. That's wonderful. But self-compassion is not saying, I want to be very clear, self-compassion is not going to a spa. Self-compassion is not saying, oh, you're wonderful and, you know, everything's great. What self-compassion really is self-compassion, like compassion for somebody else. So self-compassion begins by looking honestly, with acceptance, right? And because in other words, if you're having compassion for somebody, you're not judging them, right? So if you're having compassion for yourself, that means you're not judging yourself, right? So one has to start with self-compassion, which means to actually look at one's own suffering, and to say, and then there's a term actually from one. I like Kristen Neff, as a psychologist who does research on self-compassion, and she has this nice term I like called. She uses the term common humanity, and what she points out is she says, when we look at our compassion honestly and without judgment, then we can also recognize truthfully, I am not alone in that. Everybody, all normal people, are going to have their own version of that. Some are quite similar to me, some are different than me, and so there has to be a process in a sense of you look at those qualities, right, in ourselves, the pain and the negative patterns and the neuroses and all the other stuff, right? And one looks at them and says, that's suffering. And I'm like everybody else. I'm not unique. And I'm still worthy of love. And I'm still worthy of compassion. And I don't, even before I don't have to change those to be worthy of love and compassion. Some people have this idea like, I'll be very worthy of that when I no longer have this. But no, it's like the person who's suffering the most is the person who is most in need of and most worthy of love and compassion. So I think the first step is that, right, is to like, and that's like oftentimes to honestly introspect, right, and to say, okay, this is what's there. And what's there is worthy of love, is worthy of compassion. I, who am suffering in those ways, am worthy of love, worthy of compassion. And then one can say to oneself, because it's like compassion for somebody else, right? But first one has to say to oneself, all right, well, if this is my honest situation, and again, I'll say it this way. There are different ways to say it. I'm going to give a few options. If you have, first of all, I sometimes think of it this way. I'm going to give a Buddhist version and a non-Buddhist version. Okay, the Buddhist version I think would be, all right, that's my suffering. What would, how would my Lama or Tara or Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, what would they have to say about that? If I were with the Buddha Tara, the female Buddha of active compassion, and she saw the worst things about me, and my deepest miseries and my deepest bad qualities, what would Tara tell me? If you're not Buddhist, then Kristen Neff's research says, well, what would you say to your best friend? Say it to yourself. That's her version of it, because she's not talking Buddhist. So her version would be, if my best friend were going through that and said that's how they were feeling, what would I say to them? And she actually says, put your hand on your heart or your shoulder and say to yourself out loud what you would say to your best friend if they were going through that. So that's another version. You can do either one. You can do both of those, actually. It's nice to do. And part of it is, right, part of the interesting thing about that is it's compassion, right? So on the one hand, compassion loves and accepts as what is. But it also doesn't stay where one is, right? Whereas compassion also includes the wish to be happy, to be free from suffering, right? So compassion would be, I love you, I accept you as you are, I accept you with your darkest, deepest, to yourself, you say, right? Darkest and deepest faults and problems and pains and even bad parts or whatever, parts that hurt others or whatever have hurt others. But then also, like, because I'll use Tara as the example, right? Because Tara, the female Buddha of compassion, she wouldn't leave it at that, right? She would then say, all right, well, let's help you, right? And part of that is you would then say to yourself, all right, well, what can I do today, not right now, in this moment, to make things a little better, to make myself a little less, to heal a little of that, and tomorrow a little more, and actually every day making that a practice. And I think that's the deep implication. Jackie's teacher, Yeshe, had that quote. I love that quote where he said, if you're gentle with yourself, you'll be gentle with others. Isn't it that? And I thought it was this beautiful quote. And I think that's what this is getting at, actually, is, you know, if we say I want to be compassionate to others, we have to be able, and actually, like, it's really interesting, isn't it? If you're really practicing that, right? Because then what'll happen is, like, so you look at that, right? And I want to even go on further, actually, because then what'll happen is this, is there are a few things that will definitely happen, right? One is, you'll say, oh, what would make it better is this, then you won't do it. Sometimes, right? You know, sometimes you won't do the thing, right? And again, like, it's really hard in those moments to say, because it's a very fine line, isn't it? To, like, come back and to say, like, to oneself, actually, like, you know, I get you didn't do it, and you caused yourself more suffering, and I love you, right? And I see that you have a potential. I see you can be more free, or more healthy, or more happy, you know. And there's a kind of, because compassion has a toughness and a relentlessness to it. You know, compassion doesn't give up, and compassion keeps looking, you know. And there will be times also, I think, where, actually, it's not just a thing, it definitely happens, like for normal people, right? Where if you're doing that kind of practice towards yourself, that you'll want to distract yourself and not think about it, right? And part of the practice of compassion then would be like asking yourself honestly, well, okay, that's normal, right? Like, but if you keep doing that, if you only do that, you'll never make progress, and you'll never feel better. On the other hand, and actually, like, I shall share this. I like, you know, I mean, actually, also that book, Become Your Own Therapist, right? Like, did Dick edit that one? Something, wonderful book. And I often think that because, like, you know, like I said, I work as a psychologist, and oftentimes, or I guess I'll say it this way, you know, whether you're trying to help somebody else or you're trying to help yourself, it's the same process, which is being skillful with the pace, right? Whereas, and part of that is like in other words, like I had this one, I'll share this, I remember once, early on in my training as a psychologist, I had this supervisor, wonderful supervisor, and he said, like, he said to me, he said, you're pretty, like, you're smart and you have good intuition, but you don't know what the hell you're doing. And I said, thank you. Like, I was wanting somebody to know that. You know, I was like, thank you. You know, it was like, you know, I was in graduate school. And I was like, thank you, yes, you know, like, nobody else noticed that yet, good. And he said, and then he said, you know, because so what if you know that? Is it going to help them? You know, so what you know something that's true? Is it going to help the person? Is it the right time? Are they ready to hear that? Is it the right moment where they can have that insight and then use that, you know, to transform something? And if not, then big deal that you know it. Save it. Maybe later it'll be useful. But don't tell them that. That's useless. Tell them what's going to help them, not what's going to make you seem smart to yourself or something. Or whatever. He didn't say that. He wasn't that. He was nicer than that. But that was what I realized I was doing. But so we have to do that for ourselves, is my point, right? Like, so part of it, I guess my point is, it's pacing, right? It's going like, and there's a quote, oh wow. There was a quote that had the same, there are a bunch of quotes that all have the same meaning, but the one I remember is actually not, the one was from Lom Zoparmshe, but I don't remember the words, but the words I remember are, I think it's actually, some poet said this, don't hurry, don't rest. Don't hurry and don't rest. Which I thought was a beautiful description. Or is that if you push too hard, then your resistance comes up and you go push backwards, right? So keep moving forward, keep growing, keep facing things, but, you know, at a pace you're capable of, right? And I think, actually, I'll say one more thing, just from personal experience with myself and with other people, is that how do you know what pace you're capable of? Usually it's by making mistakes, right? Like, it's like going too, sometimes it's going too slow and then like being like, oh yeah, I'm really comfortable going at this pace. Well, I've been going at this pace now for a while and I'm not making any progress. Okay, I was lying to myself. I was just avoiding, you know. Then sometimes it's the other side, right? Where it's like you start pushing so hard, and then you have some kind of like, what's the word? You get all uptight and you not like, and then you have to go, oh, okay. But compassion is you're willing to make the mistakes and to learn from them and go, oh, okay, well, be gentle about it and say, well, of course I made a mistake. Now I know how to slow down. And of course I made a mistake. Now I know that I was lying to myself and saying I was going slow and really I was avoiding the issue, but now I can push harder on that one. You know, and I think that's the process. And one of the things I think is like that we have to keep doing that process for a long time, isn't it? Like, in other words, because it becomes layer after layer. Yeah. Well, and part of that is like, that's funny. It's actually like I was going to say it's not 3 countless gradients because because one does at the 8th bhumi a person doesn't have any more mental afflictions, so they don't have any. But as long as you actually that's interesting. If you were thinking of it that way, if you were to say as long as you have mental afflictions, in one sense you could say that. I'm not sure. It's either it would either be 1 countless gradient or 2. I'm not sure. I think I'm joking partly, but I'm partly joking about that. But the point is like I think the point is this actually. If you think of it this way, like in the actually this is I think a good metaphor or a good like when they talk about bodhisattvas who are very like quite advanced beings or something in their process, what they actually say is that there are all these like layers of mental afflictions. And what they say is like as they progress, these are ones like we've seen emptiness directly and so on. They still have mental afflictions, but that they abandon like they actually have a categorization as you go through the levels, bodhisattva levels, that there are like 9 levels of mental afflictions, and so some have gotten totally rid of the first, but they still have the other 8, and then some have gotten rid of 2, and they have. And I guess the point is that, but the point I'm getting at is this: is that the level, like what one is working on, becomes subtler and subtler, and less and less. There comes a point where I think like they actually like they're like those beings actually don't really suffer. Actually, they no longer suffer really, not in any real way, or they don't suffer compared to us anyway. So I guess the point is like I think like they're. Yeah, so I think that's a good way to say it, is that they're, like, as one progresses, there are still things to work on, but they become more and more subtle. And part of the point there is that one becomes happier and happier as one goes through that. And, yeah, and maybe I'll share this very brief story, a personal story related to that, just a small one. But I remember this one time, it was when I was living in Santa Barbara. Oh, you probably heard that story before, but I was living in Santa Barbara, and I was actually doing my PhD studies, and I was working with people with autism, and I was like very stressed out at the time. And then I read this line from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I think I can remember the exact. There's a famous line. It's been many times, but it said, "The sun of real happiness shines in your life the moment you begin to cherish others." It was something like that. Yeah, it was something like that. The moment you begin to cherish others. So love, right? He was saying it. And I remember I read that quote, and I thought, I was like, I'm not feeling the sun of happiness at all. I'm totally stressed out. I'm exhausted. I'm not feeling. And I was like, and I think I'm doing pretty. I cherish others. And then I like had to sit down, and I was like, it was really funny. I remember this. I just sat there, and I looked at that quote, and I just stared at the quote, and I was like, yeah, no, I'm not cherishing. Like I'm not being loving actually. Like, and I was like, I thought I would. Like, and I actually went through like what's the word? Like an inner, what's the word? Like assessment. And I was like, yeah, like I have a few moments, like in the last month or something. I don't know. It was like at work, I had a few moments of actual feeling of genuine, heartfelt love for the people I was working with. But a lot of the time, I was just feeling busy and like doing tasks. And I was like at school, I was like, oh, I'm doing well in my studies and I'm working hard, but I'm not actually feeling in the moment love. And then in my personal life, I wasn't having that much overwhelming because I was too tired and stressed out. And I was like, well, and actually it was interesting because Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying this point. He was saying the moment, he said the moment you cherish others, there's happiness. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to test. I'm going to see if I agree with Lama. I was like, one way, I was like, oh, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I always agree. But I was like, no, I have to see if my own experience agrees, or else like, it's not meaningful. And then I thought, and then through my own experimentation, I was like, oh, he's right. I was like, when I actually feel love when I feel overwhelming feeling of love, I feel so peaceful. It's like I can actually see it. I was like,
so it really starts with the self, cherishing oneself and then you radiate the love.
Yeah, that's right. You have to love yourself, and then you can love others. Yeah, and it's not. I mean, it's not actually, what's the word? I mean, in one sense, it's not. Obviously, it's not that linear in the sense of like the person perfectly loves himself and then they perfectly love others. But it's really true though. I'll say this point. Like, I've just seen this over and over, so I'll just share it. Like, it's just true. Actually, it's just a very true thing. Like, if you, like, for example, if somebody, I've seen this so many times. If somebody's a parent, it's actually, because my point is this: especially with the people closest to you. So if you're in an intimate relationship, or you're a parent, or you're whatever, like then whatever you do to yourself, you're going to do to the other person who's close. You can fake it with people who. My point is just you can fake it and pretend if somebody's very distant, right? Like, if you meet somebody in the grocery store and you say, "Oh, hi, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope everything's great for you," that you can just be phony or whatever. But if you have somebody who you're very intimate with, who you live with, or who and who really is going to, then you actually won't be able to. Whatever you do to yourself, you'll do to them, and you won't be able to be much kinder to them than you are to yourself. Maybe a tiny bit. But when they're being annoying to you, which means they're pushing up against your self, ego or whatever, then you'll do to them what you do to yourself when you're agitated, and you won't mean to, and so that's where that comes from, isn't it? Is like, and that's why actually in the teachings on bodhicitta, actually I'll say this point too about self-compassion. Sometimes people don't talk about it this way, but actually there's no doubt it's true. If you look at the meaning of compassion, for people who've studied the stages of the path, Lamrim, stages of the path to enlightenment, the low scope and the middle scope, what they call in that text, which are about they're about developing your own aspiration to have good future lives and aspiration to achieve your own liberation from suffering. They say if you haven't realized those, you won't realize bodhicitta. Actually, they say it's impossible. And what that's saying is actually the same thing. If you don't have compassion for yourself, there's a quote from, I think it's Shantideva said this. He said, if you haven't, he's actually said this. He said, if somebody says, "Oh, I want to lead all sentient beings to enlightenment," right? They have some kind of like word like that, right? But then he says, but if Shantideva says, but if the person hasn't even in their dreams, he says, they haven't dreamt of liberating themselves from samsara, he said, then how can that be anything but empty words? Whereas if the person doesn't even understand their own suffering and hasn't faced it and hasn't developed an actual aspiration to liberate themselves from it, then the words, "Oh, I'm going to liberate others from it," is like, he said, it's like hollow, just hollow words, really, isn't it? So so that's that, right? It's like we have to, and it's true actually, right? Because in other words, the idea, "Oh, I'm going to have compassion for others' suffering, but I'm not going to face my own," is like ridiculous, right? Because you won't be able to empathize with others' suffering.
But it's so much more fun to deal with other people rather than dealing with yourself.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's a distraction, right? Yeah. Actually, I often think of that quote. There's a famous quote from Carl Jung, who's a Swiss psychiatrist, who said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." That was a beautiful quote. I thought it was a very profound point. But it's true, actually. I'll just say from my own experience, like, it's actually true. Like, it is if you can't empathize. Even like I've just had this experience. It's my own personal experience, and it's been said by other people, but I can verify it. Is like if you're not willing to face an aspect of yourself, right, and then somebody else is having a similar issue, you won't be able to empathize. You can't do it, actually, because it would force you to face that part of yourself. And so you just won't be able to. You'll sit there, you won't understand what they're talking about, or like it's not possible. And that's in a way the same thing that Buddhism is saying, right? If you haven't faced, that's what Shantideva was saying when he says, if you haven't dreamt of your own liberation, how can you think, "Oh, I'm going to liberate others from suffering"? If you haven't faced your own suffering, then you don't understand what suffering is. So how do you understand that others are suffering, right? And that's why in the sequence, we have to first, develop our own aspiration to liberation, and then develop the aspiration to liberate others to liberate others. It doesn't work otherwise. So if the person wants to realize bodhicitta, they have to go step by step like that. There's no other choice. It was a great question. Other questions?
going back to what you said, and I believe it to be, from my experience, true. When you talked about when you include love and that, but yet, like, you also need to be able to see, I took it as see from the mind, each one as an individual, okay? And my question is that, well, it's not a question. I know I get agitated when, and I find this in a lot in classes of Buddhism and not in other settings. When people want to ask a question, they go, well, when we, and because not, I mean, I was taught, yes, we're interdependent, but we all have different views. And not everybody feels the same way or is at a certain, so when people, since I'm little, I've never understood asking a question and including like the whole, well, we all feel like, and I, rather than a question, let's say I might have to you, would be when I'm trying to meditate on this happens, like your friend.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't see what's wrong, why, it's very hard, since I'm little, it's hard for me to understand why people are afraid to individualize, because in the Lorne, which I studied a few times, it doesn't say we feel like this. You know, if you had like the questions going back and forth between Chikawa and my mind is a little bit, but what I'm saying is that in Buddhist classes, I find that, and this is my stuff, I know that, you know, I get kind of agitated when other people include, well, when we all feel like this, and in my head I go, well, how do they know how we all feel? Or I mean, like your mom, I don't know how she feels at the moment. I don't know how, if I did, that would be very wonderful. I'd be enlightened, I'd be flying across the sky. You know, and
I think I was thinking of something that I'm sure it was Rinpoche who said that we need to not we need to, but I was just doing what you're saying, but in the long run sometimes it says you, well the you is me, it's like I. So when I'm working like with some ideas in the long run, I try to say I. I. and that, I think that's what you're kind of projecting that everybody should say, but
not that
you know, or
should. I mean, like when I never
yeah,
should.
but you can do it for yourself. You know, it's like I can't make someone else.
No,
think
I'm
of
not
it.
talking about what I can make others do. I just
Yeah.
said to Lorne, I was just talking about myself, that it hurts me, and my question is, how can I get it not to hurt me? You know,
That's
I mean, that's being
I
very
get it.
honest.
Yeah, no, I
I
get the
mean,
question.
like, you talk about honesty, I can't talk, I'm not going, oh, this should happen because, but if you're training in bodhicitta, training in love, I
Actually,
think these
I'll say-
questions have to arise and ask the teacher.
You know, first of all, actually, I'll say a couple comments. One is, I mean, questions are good. I've enjoyed having people ask questions. And actually, I love this. I've never heard anybody else say this except Gyumri Khyentse also. He said one time, he said, asking questions is part of the practice of the perfection of wisdom. He said, because if you don't ask questions, you won't develop wisdom. So he said, it's part of your practice. So then one time he was saying, he said, does anybody have any questions? And nobody asked any questions. He said, no, nobody's practicing the perfection of wisdom today, or something, which is a great answer. And then, I guess regarding you actually, I think you answered your own question, actually, so I'll say what I think you
Okay.
answered. I'll say the answer I think you gave.
Okay, good, because
Um,
that's it.
Because you said, and I
Okay.
think you know, maybe you're right, I don't know. I mean, I haven't noticed that phenomenon, but, because I probably maybe I didn't pay attention or something, but you said, that if sometimes a person would say we, and then you said something like, you know, that they're maybe afraid to be so vulnerable to say I. And then part of that would be, like, so there is, if I assume you're correct, which I'm not sure, but let's assume you're correct, because that's
Okay.
reasonable. Then it would be to recognize, like, that vulnerability, right? The vulnerability of saying, even with one person, much less with a group, if you're in a class, is hard. You know, like, I remember a researcher, probably the most well-known researcher on vulnerability these days, Brene Brown, who's also been on TV a lot and things, and has a TED Talk. And she talks about, she actually has one of the titles of her book is Daring Greatly. And she points this out, that to be vulnerable is daring. And especially, in general it is, and then especially in our culture, because our culture doesn't always place a great emphasis on the benefits of vulnerability, right? And when people are vulnerable, they sometimes get treated terribly. And that's been true in our culture in general, and that's often true. That's often been true of women in our culture. Many times women have been treated terribly. Many times people from various groups have been treated terribly. And so I guess my point is that I think part of that would be, so your point was, if the person's scared to be vulnerable, there's nothing more human than that. Like, what a deeply human thing, right? If a person has a question and they want to ask the question, but then they're feeling scared to be vulnerable while asking a question, and if they were to then ask the question in a way that was like, in order to be a little self-protective, you know, or keep it a little less about, you know, I feel this, or I made this mistake, or I, like, you know, it's like what's that thing? You know, it's like the old joke where, you know, the person says, you know, to the doctor, oh, I have a friend who, you know, like, I have a friend who's having this problem. Do you have any, what should I tell them? You know, and it's like, well, I don't want to say it's me. You know, but that's a self-protective thing, and to recognize that's normal and that's so human, right? To feel afraid to be too vulnerable, and that if somebody is trying to protect themselves, but they're taking even a half a step by asking the question, like, good. I mean, how, you know, like, because how else can the person go forward? You know, and when the person, and part of it also, I'll make one more point about vulnerability, because, and actually maybe this is another answer to your question, another way of thinking about your question, is because part of it is people have to feel safe, right? In other words, actually nobody's going to be vulnerable unless they feel safe, and we shouldn't, actually. Whereas if I say, you know, if I were to put out my most vulnerable thing on, I'm not on Twitter, but if I were to put it on Twitter, like, kind of stupid. You know, like, people are crazy in the world. You know, people say mean things. You know, like, if I'm feeling scared, in other words, I shouldn't do that. I should find somebody I deeply trust. And so it would be, so maybe the answer would be like, well, one is, okay, the person's maybe afraid and feeling nervous about being vulnerable. And the other is, well, how can I help? And actually, if that were my experience in any community, actually, I guess my question would then be, well, what can I personally do to help create more safety? Because then people will feel safer, you know, and are there ways to help create safety? And can I contribute to that?
Like, this question I had, why I asked it was, I asked Gumit Kessler the Crochet, and he told me the first time I was there. And when I asked that, after discussing other things, he said, and the same thing, Lama Zopa, they all have told me the same exact thing, is that our society thinks it's a bad thing and we always have to feel safe. He says, but actually, the nature of the Four Noble Truths is we're all suffering. And if you don't, that you have to practice to get to a point where you have courage to know that within being vulnerable and asking, it's the only way to achieve what the long room says, step by step. Otherwise, it's like you can't. How do you achieve any? I mean, it's the first. When I first contacted, when I first came across, in the early 70s, I mean, this was the only thing that made sense to me, because my whole life it was, don't talk about those things, if you make yourself like that people will like I was that powerful. And in Buddhism, it was, especially in this tradition, following step by step by step over many decades. Like if you don't have, like you were talking about love for yourself, but enough courage, which I think is equal, love, courage, compassion, how would you ever achieve what Jita, ever achieve wisdom? So that's what I was saying about the we questions, and I don't want to sit in a class. No, I don't want to be, I don't want my mind to get so attached when someone uses, well, we all feel this.
I guess for one point I'll make, I know some in a couple minutes, but one point I'll make is that when the advice that, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche mentioned or Khyentse Rinpoche gave to you, then first of all, of course you should practice that because that's the advice to you. But that doesn't mean that somebody else necessarily is in a place where that advice applies to them at that time. So the advice they gave for you is of course then good, and that sounds like very wise advice. But that doesn't mean that somebody else, like, so if they were saying something about, for example, for you about how to work with the Four Noble Truths and the truth of suffering and courage and so on, then that's perfect advice, actually. But that doesn't mean that somebody else is necessarily at the point in their life where that applies to them. So it's in a way, it's back, it's sort of having tolerance that different people can be
that
different
was
things.
my answer, right there, tolerance.
Tolerance.
Because I don't want to be in a room and have that thought. It's a negative thought which perpetuates like non-virtue, that when I hear the word we from others, instead of listening, I'm so attached to the we. And you just gave me my answer, which was tolerance.
Tolerance for differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which are many things I have, but on that one, and it's just in the last few years. And it's not a judgment, but I've noticed within myself that I get so attached to that that I'm not even listening to anything else.
Well, I'm not a scholar as our teacher is. I'm really impressed and very enjoying tonight a whole lot. But at a practical level, I find that if the mind ever goes into a spasm like that, the very best thing is to put the mind in neutral with breathing meditation, and don't formulate any thoughts one way or the other. Just get one center again. And that's a huge practice because there's a lot of opportunity to go haywire.
Yeah.
So instead of engaging in any kinds of thoughts, I find myself going in neutral so now I can re-engage in a positive direction. Sometimes I have to stay in neutral a very long time. So this would be a great opportunity for you to practice just being calm and let everything go blah, 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 blah. And you just stay calm. It's a great practice.
Yeah.
Very wise advice.
Yeah, no, don't try.
No,
Do it.
Do it.
Okay. No, truly.
Yeah,
You just
no,
have to do it.
it's good
But
advice.
it's like Lorne said, it doesn't happen right away. You have to practice because the mind's going to continually go the route that it's been going. So you continually put it back in neutral. You'll be happy.
Actually, I know we'll stop in a second. I actually want to ask you guys one question just for me, for tomorrow, for people, I don't know if it's coming or not, but just to help me formulate something. Yeah, so tomorrow's topic, right, is about, it's partly about joyous effort, right, and it's partly about embracing life as it is. So it's connected to the question that you had asked earlier, I think, embracing both the easy and difficult, the good and the bad. And definitely, there are a few things I definitely want to present in terms of how joyous effort works, and there's some beautiful teachings on that from Lama Tsongkhapa I want to share that people I think maybe haven't studied, and they're really quite beautiful. But then I guess the question I have is like, I just want to get feedback, like, because there are a few options. Like one is I can do more like, presenting and then some question and answer. I can also include a few like interactive exercises to sort of process the purpose of those is just to process the material, or we can also do a little more meditation on the topics. And any of those is fine with me. Do people have preference of how to balance those? All three. Does that feel right? To include some meditate more. I mean, because tomorrow's a little longer, so there can be like a few meditations, maybe a few interactive. Because to me, the goal of all that is just to be able to, like, different people process information differently and integrate it. And so I want to sort of figure out what helps. Different groups are also different. Some groups just don't want to do interactive exercises, or some groups want to do more meditation, some want to do less. So, do people feel like that? That a mixture of all three? Whoever. I mean, is that good? Okay. So I'll integrate. I'll include some of each of those. But well, actually we're at 9, so we should probably stop. But maybe we can just dedicate. In Buddhism, there's always this thing of we started with love, right? So that was the motivation. And so there's this idea, actually, like together we created some positive merit, or karma, or positive karma. Say that way. And so we can just, since we started with love, maybe we can end with dedicating with love. So like we can each, you can vary this for yourself, but like through the positive energy or positive merit or positive karma we created together, motivated by love, may, first of all, may everyone here continue a process of ever increasing love, right, towards ourselves, towards those close to us, towards strangers, towards those we think of as enemies, and eventually for each and all beings. And then through that, may we help to spread, and share love with others. And through the power of love and compassion, may we realize bodhicitta, progress to the state of Buddhahood, which is the ultimate perfection of love and compassion and wisdom. And thereby may we lead all sentient beings everywhere on a path of love and compassion towards each of their ultimate achievement of enlightenment. So they each have achieved the perfection of love and compassion. And thank you, everybody.
And I just wanted to remind everyone too, since we're talking about bodhicitta, we just started last night the bodhicitta module of Discovering Buddhism, Thursday nights for the next 2 months. So if you're interested in that topic, please join us. And also on February 23rd, Jackie Keeley will be leading